Hello, my name is Casey Jackson. I did my poetry presentation over the poem called Home Burial by Robert Frost. I'll be explaining two elements of poetry in this poem, which are theme and tone. This poem represents many moments of tense dialogue and a strained relationship between a husband and wife who have lost their child. The woman is distraught after catching sight of the child's grave through the window, and she becomes more emotional when her husband doesn't immediately recognize the cause of her distress. The husband begins to come up the stairs to talk to his wife, but she does everything she can to avoid talking to him. She tries to leave the house, but he asks her to stay and share her grief with him so he has a chance to help her. He doesn't understand what it is he does that offends her or why she is grieving for such a long time. She resents him for his composure, what she sees as his hard-heartedness. She vents some of her anger and frustration, and he receives it, but the distance between them remains the same. She opens the door to leave as he calls for her to come back. The poem ends with an unknown. The wife has opened the door to leave, and her husband is threatening to go after her and bring her back if she leaves. This ending leaves the reader guessing whether she manages to leave and whether or not the couple fixes their communication problem. This is a dramatic poem. It presents a continuous scene and employs primarily dialogue rather than narrative or description. It is dramatic, too, in its subject matter, dramatic in the sense of emotional or tense. Form fits content well in this poem. One can easily imagine two actors on stage portraying this brief charged scene. An important aspect of this poem is tone. The tone between the husband and wife. They are both going through the death of their child differently, and neither one of them are comforting each other. The wife's tone is usually upset or annoyed towards her husband, and the husband's tone is confused and annoyed towards his wife. Home Burial is one of Frost's most sad poems. There are two tragedies in this poem: the death of a child and the collapse of a marriage. Home Burial is about grief and grieving, but most of all it seems to be about the breakdown and limits of communication. The husband and the wife represent two very different ways of grieving. The wife's grief infuses every part of her. The husband, on the other hand, has accepted the death. Time has passed, and he might be more likely now to say, "That's the way of the world," rather than "the world's evil." He did grieve, but the outward indications of his grief were quite different from those of his wife. He threw himself into the horrible task of digging his own child's grave. This action further associates the father with a way-of-the-world mentality, with the cycles that make up the farmer's life, and with an organic view of life and death. The father did not leave the task of burial to someone else. Instead, he physically dug into the earth and planted his child's body in the soil. The theme of this poem isn't to determine the right way to grieve. Rather, it intends to portray a failure of empathy and communication. During the whole poem, the couple doesn't do much of communicating with one another. In the beginning, the woman hardly speaks to her husband at all. Then, when she finally opens up to him, she barely listens to what he says. This poem is more of a fight rather than a conversation. Each person fails to appreciate the other's grieving process, fails to credit it, allow it, and have patience with it, and each fails to alter even slightly his or her own form of grief in order to accommodate the other. Another theme in this poem is power. The power in the relationship shifts between the two of them. At times, one person has all the power, and sometimes the other does. While they fight about their dead child, they also fight over control in their conversation and in their relationship. Thank you for watching my presentation.